We're going to read two passages. The first one is from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 5 and the first 7 verses. And then we're going to flick over to John's Gospel and chapter 15 and read the first 8 verses. So you may want to put a finger in John's Gospel as we read from the book of Isaiah. And chapter 5 and these opening verses, they are entitled, at least in my Bible, as the Song of the Vineyard. Isaiah writes, I will sing for my loved one, or the one I love, a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones, and he planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it, and he cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there, and I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are the garden of his delight. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. And going across to John chapter 15 and the first 8 verses. This is Jesus speaking. On the very night that he was arrested and tried and eventually crucified, he said these words, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be given you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. I expect for many of us, that passage from John chapter 15 is very familiar. The whole idea that Jesus is the vine, we are the branches. And it's a very, very familiar passage indeed. But the passage from Isaiah, I wonder how familiar you are with that one. We don't hear that quite so often, do we? In a sense, it's a very sad passage. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it's not so popular. It's a very sad passage. Although saying it's a sad passage, it starts off looking very hopeful. If you've got it, you might just want to turn to it again, and let's just have a look for a few minutes at what's going on in Isaiah chapter 5 and these opening 7 verses. This is the Lord speaking about his relationship with his people, his chosen people, Israel. He loved them. He loved them so dearly, and he likens them to a vineyard. Now, it has to be said, some of the Old Testament passages, some of the imagery that are there may not be quite as flattering as you might like. I was just reading Song of Songs the other day and looking at some of the imagery that the lover says about his beloved. And I thought to myself, if I said some of those things to Lisa, she'd probably clomp me one. And rightly so. You are a gazelle, my dear. I'm sure she would not be greatly impressed at some of those things. And I'm sure that the nation of Israel, actually some of the imagery that God uses for the one he loves here is maybe for a nation it's not so bad. Maybe for an individual it would be much worse. But the point is, it's poetical. The point is that poetry comes from the heart. It's called The Song of the Vineyard. Now, I know that's a title that's been put on in modern times to it. But it's a bit of poetry. And poetry comes when our heart is moved. And God's heart was moved for the nation of Israel. He loved Israel. He loved Israel deeply. And so he makes up this song about her and says, it's like a vineyard. Look how much care he takes for the vineyard. He decides that he wants to plant a beautiful vineyard. He doesn't just get some grapevines and stick them in the ground. Look at the care that he takes. First of all, notice that he goes to a fertile hillside. A fertile hillside. And no doubt, it doesn't say so, but the direction would have been favourable of the hillside too. So they got maximum sun. The fertile hillside. Grapes do well on hillsides. They don't actually like to get too wet. Although saying that, they claim that one of the reasons why the great grapevine at Hampton Court is so good is because its roots actually go into the Thames. But traditionally we've always said that grapes don't like to get too wet. And so they put them on a hillside so that the water will drain away. They still need a lot of water, but they won't be sitting in a bog. But not only that, the hillside that he chooses is not an arid, barren hillside. It's a fertile hillside. It's got a lot of nutrition to it. The plants that he plants in the ground will have every chance of receiving the nutrients that are there. The second thing that we notice is that he goes around and he digs out all the stones out of the soil. And he takes those stones and he uses them actually. They were obviously fairly big stones. It wasn't just kind of little grit pea shingle or something like that. But we're talking quite big stones, and he takes them and he does something with those stones. The first thing that he does is that he builds a watchtower around it, or in it. And the watchtower is really important because there were lots of people who would be ready to come and steal your crops. And so harvests were very precious things. And we are living in an age where we have everything so readily available that we don't work for it. If you want a bunch of grapes, just go into the supermarket any time of the year and you can pick them up. And anything else that you want as well. But for these people, it was different. The grapes came just once a year. They were a precious harvest. And they needed caring for throughout the whole year. Because if you miss your chance, that's it. Nothing for another 12 months. And so the watchtower is really important. The watchtower had a dual purpose. Number one is that it was a place where, particularly as the crop reached its maturity, that was the time where you would go up onto the upper level of the watchtower and just literally keep a check over your fields, your vineyard, just to make sure there was nobody out there stealing your grapes or whatever crop that you were planted. The second thing is it also provided a shelter, because sometimes the field where you grow your crop might be some distance from your home. And so particularly at harvest time, you really had to work very hard, long days. And so the idea was you would gather in your crop and you would perhaps sleep in the shelter too, in the tower. So it provided the shelter, just to make sure you were on hand and that you wouldn't lose your crop, and that nobody would steal it once it was harvested too. The next thing he did was that he dug out a wine press. He made a wine press so that he could actually turn the grapes into a good wine there and then on the spot. He was doing everything, preparing it. You also discover a bit further down that he built a wall around it too. And the wall was there to try again keep out those who would seek to destroy your crops too. And that might have been people, but actually sometimes animals also would come in and have a little munch away. Now, I don't know really what pests they had exactly out there at that time that the wall would stop. I find that the worst pests for my grapes are the wasps. There's not a lot you can do about that, is there really? The wasps come in and so what I do now is that I watch very carefully. I use the wasps to my advantage. And so as the grapes are getting ready and getting closer and closer to that point, I watch very carefully to see how much interest the wasps are showing. And sometimes they kind of buzz around and they go off somewhere else. And I know the grapes aren't ready. As soon as you see them settling and starting to have a bit of a munch, you know the grapes are there. And so it's time to get out there pretty quickly. Because as to my cost, I have found that they will strip the grapevine in literally a day or two, if you let them. But this man, he's taken great care. He's done absolutely everything he can for the vineyard. And then when it came to harvest time, and he goes out and he looks for the grapes, and there they are, and they're looking ripe and ready, and he picks one of the grapes and he puts it in his mouth, and instead of being beautiful and sweet, it's sour, and he spits it out. What a horrible grape. What a terrible thing. And yet it had every advantage going to turn it into the best grape ever. Why? And he's very angry. And he decides that after all the work that he's put into it and all the effort there, the many weeks and months that he has waited and watched over it and been so careful with it all to get absolutely nothing at the end of it, he decides there's only one course of action. I'll tear it up. I'll break down the wall so that anybody can get in. Talking about people getting in, it just reminded me, of course, in the Song of Solomon, it actually talks about, or the Song of Songs, whichever you want to call it, it talks about the little foxes. I don't know if you know that verse. It talks about the little foxes who tear up the vines. So that maybe that's one of the reasons for the wall, was just to keep those sort of animals out, perhaps too. But anyway, moving on. But the point is, I'm going to tear down the wall. He says, I'm not going to get the weeds out. I'm just going to let the brambles grow. I'm going to let the vines get choked up with the weeds. I'm not going to water it. I've been watering it all this time. I'm not going to water it anymore. I take my love away from all of this. Now, this, of course, is an anecdote. It's a picture. It's a story, a parable almost, if you like, to use a New Testament equivalent. But what is it talking about? And well, he tells us the answer to that. He says, "The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are the garden of his delight." Feel the pain in his heart? That's who they were. I built this vineyard, and I've told you the story about the love that was put into this vineyard, the hard work and the effort. It was you I was talking about, God says to Israel. It's you. That's who the story's about. That's who the song is written about. But what did he find? What he tells us at the end. He says, "I looked for justice, for the good grapes, but I found bloodshed, the sour grapes. He looked for righteousness, but he heard cries of distress." The very things that he hoped to see in the nation of Israel, the good, the righteousness that should have been there in the nation, he said was gone, and it was full of injustice and terrible wickedness instead. And God says, "I am distressed at my chosen, beloved people and what they have done." Well, of course, that was true of Israel throughout their history at different times. There were times when they were more faithful to the Lord and where justice and goodness could be seen. And then they went through periods where they went downhill rather rapidly sometimes. And they turned to complete injustice, where they turned into the bad grapes, the sour grapes. It was a perennial problem with the nation. But actually, it was a problem that really didn't surprise God. God knows all about that issue. He knew that when he called Israel. From the very time, in fact, before the time of the creation of the world even, he knew that. But at the time when he called Abraham and told Abraham that I'm going to make you into a great nation, he knew that Israel would actually sin. That Israel would turn into a bad nation at times, as well as sometimes a good nation. He knew all about that. He wasn't blind to it. But as we've said before many times, that when we look at God's plan of salvation, you've got to look at the Bible as a whole. You can't actually just take out one small passage and look at it in complete isolation to everything else. Let me just remind you. Let's go back in our thoughts at least, right back to the very beginning, right back to Genesis. And there, right at the beginning in Genesis, God creates this absolutely perfect world. Sin is not there. It's not been ruined. It is absolute paradise. And then human beings messed it all up by listening not to God, but to the deceiver instead. And Satan tricks Adam and Eve into sin. And from that moment on, and the Bible doesn't spend an awful lot of time actually right at the beginning talking about that perfect paradise. It's just quite short really, just 2 chapters, and then the 3rd chapter looks at the fall of man. But from that moment on, from chapter 3 of Genesis, when it all went wrong, the rest of the Bible is all about talking about God restoring what had fallen, the mess that we have made. God started with Adam and Eve and they failed. They failed abysmally. And so a little bit later on, as the wickedness grows in the earth, remember that God then brings the whole of the human race down to Noah and his family, the most righteous people he can find. And yet, even though bringing it right the way down, cutting the nation, the population right down to just this one righteous family, that after the flood and the population grows again, so the wickedness grows as well. So it proves that even if you take the best of the human race, you will not end up with a perfect people. We will revert back to sin, destruction, bloodshed, and all the horrors that go with it. So that didn't work. Later on, we find that God called Abraham. As he calls Abraham, he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. So we can't do it with the whole world, but again, we'll start with this one man who is, he's a righteous man. He's a good man. We'll take Abraham, and Abraham, you're a good man, and from you we're going to create a nation that will serve me and honor me and glorify me, and they will represent me in the world, and they will show all of the nations around. Remember that right from the very start, the promise to Abraham was that all nations will be blessed through you. That was always the plan. Everybody will hear. And the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, grew and grew and grew, but they sinned and they sinned and they sinned. They let God down. When Moses came along and God realized that the people were really struggling to actually act as good people anyway, he was forced to give them a code, the law as we call it. The problem with the law is that the law actually didn't help them either in the end. I mean, there's nothing wrong in having it. I mean, it was good to have the code because they couldn't manage on their own. And God says, let me help you here. Let me put some boundaries in place. But the moment the boundaries were put in place, they crossed the boundaries. They stepped outside of what God had permitted. They failed again. And the law, in a sense, failed to do what it should have done. Now, we know that everyone is born with that sin already inside them. If you like, it's a genetic thing. We could describe it like that in this day and age. That it's there from the moment that I was conceived, David says, I was sinful. He knew that. And yet, in theory, the Bible also speaks about someone who might keep the law to the absolute letter. Someone who might actually all the days of their life have kept it, and in that sense become a righteous person. And yet the Bible also acknowledges that not one person has even done that. So even if you could do it by works, in other words, we've all failed anyway. You can't keep it up. What hope is there for the human race? We're left in absolute despair. Absolute despair. I could go on giving you examples. The kings of Israel is another one. I mentioned that many times to you. But each king who's come to rescue the people and to put them back into God's favour fails again and again and again. And so the little summary of their life always finishes, and then they died, and then they died, and then they died. But now, let's go across to the New Testament. Let's go across to John's Gospel and chapter 15. God recognized the failure that had happened in the nation of Israel. And he says that I cannot make this people good. I've demonstrated that it is absolutely impossible by doing it through human means. There is only one way to turn the bad grapes into something good. You see, the problem was not the soil in Isaiah 5. Did you notice that? The problem was not the soil was fertile. The problem was not the fact of water because he watered it. It wasn't the enemies coming in to steal because he put the watchtower up and he kept a close watch on it. He put a wall around it to stop any animals coming in and destroying the vineyard and digging it up. He did all of those things. The problem was the vines themselves. Now just imagine that God had built the vineyard again. A precious vineyard. Just imagine that. Imagine that he says that he relents and he says, I'll have a second go. after his anger dies down and he's torn up the walls and everything else and he's destroyed the vineyard, let's just suppose that this time he does it again. And he does everything perfectly. And he sets out the garden of his delight again. But this time, instead of taking the choicest vine and putting it in there, he takes a unique vine. It's not just the best that could be found, but he actually breeds, if you like, a brand new vine. And he plants this brand new vine. It's like no other vine that anyone has ever seen before. And that vine is Jesus. Absolutely perfect. What happens this time? The vine grows and flourishes. And Jesus says, I am the vine, but you're no longer the vines. But he says, you're the branches. You're connected to the perfect rootstock. You're connected to the one that will not fail. And if there happens to be a branch that's not bearing fruit, well, then it's time to prune. We take those branches out. And the branches that do bear good fruit, well, that's great because that's what we're after. We're looking for a harvest. We're looking for a good harvest. And that when it comes to harvest times, we're looking for big, juicy grapes on the vine. And that is how it's produced through Jesus. The problem, Jesus says, is the branches that are no longer attached. Maybe they've got damaged somehow, disconnected, therefore, to the root. And as they do that, so they'll shrivel up. And he says what happens to those? They get taken out of the vine and destroyed, burned by fire. The wonderful thing is that as Jesus speaks, and remember that as he's speaking at this very moment, he's speaking to Jews. He's speaking, I said to you earlier, on the very night that he was arrested. That they have been in the upper room together. And maybe they're heading out towards the Garden of Gethsemane. And they probably had to go past the temple, and there at the temple gate was the golden vine. And I can just kind of imagine that the golden vine, which was full of golden grapes, was glinting in the moonlight. Can you just imagine the imagery of it all? And it spurs Jesus on just to tell this story. Apparently the golden vine, you could ask to have a golden grape attached to the golden vine for a particular blessing that God had bestowed upon you. And so you could then go along and just say, well, I'd like my grape added. And so it was full of good grapes. But Jesus is looking and saying, it's not that. That's not really the blessing. The blessing is you attached to me. But the other wonderful thing is that here is where we see a big change, because not only is Jesus speaking to Jews here, but he's just about to send those same Jews out into the world and to attach branches into the vine, so to speak. So that exactly what God said to Abraham, all nations will be blessed through you, happened because through the Jews salvation comes. That we receive our salvation through Jesus, through the nation of Israel, therefore. And as a result of that we who remain attached to Christ, who get our energy from him, who get all of our resources from him, the guarantee is this, that you will bear good fruit. You will bear good fruit. Not only that, not only is it good fruit, but he says, go and bear fruit that will last. It's not a fruit that's going to go bad quickly. Fruit that has been damaged will very quickly deteriorate. But he says, you're perfect. You're a lasting fruit. What a wonderful thought. He says you're going to bear much fruit. He's not expecting 1 or 2 grapes from you. He's expecting bunches and bunches. One of the things that when God's people were brought out of Egypt and towards the land of Canaan, the promised land, which later became the land of Israel, you remember the story of the spies that went in. And as the spies went into the land, they were to go and seek out the land, and they came back bringing evidence of the fertility of the land. What was that evidence? Grapes. What they brought back was on poles, it says. The grapes were so huge that they actually had to carry them on poles between them. Yeah, so a long pole, one man at the front, one at the back, and the grapes literally dangling over the poles because they were so big, so heavy. That's how they carried them back. Now, I've never seen grapes like that before. But that's what God expects from us, from his people, from those who love him, from those who remain attached to him. Go and bear much fruit. Are you bearing fruit? Because that's, of course, the question we've got to ask. What fruit are you bearing? Well, of course, there's obviously spiritual fruit. I mean, that's a fairly obvious one, isn't it? That we, deep in our heart, should be bearing spiritual fruit. But out of the spiritual fruit comes other things too. Remember, the thing that distressed the Lord in Isaiah was the fact that he looked for the good grapes, but what did he find? He found injustice. He found bloodshed. He found violence. But we as Christian people are changed. Our character is different. And we have his character through the Holy Spirit that grows and develops inside of us. And we should see all of that not just in our own lives and in amongst the people at the church. So we come to church on a Sunday and we're one person, and on Monday we're somebody different. No, as we go out into the world around us, we also see the qualities of God in our lives spread out to the world around us too. That we do stand up for the injustice that goes on in our world. That's a good quality. That we stand against those who are being abused. That's a good quality. But remember, it comes, first of all, out of the love that's in your heart, which comes from God. We love because he first loved us. And so I just really want to encourage you very simply today to look at your own life and say, is there fruit? And if not, are you still attached to the vine? Are you taking your energy from Jesus? Or are you getting it from somewhere else? Because it will make a big difference on the end result. When he comes to look for the fruit that you bear, let me ask you the question, what will he find? Let's pray.